Thank you, Madam. I've now.
We get into the main business of the day. We have prepared an updated document with all of the proposed modifications, which post-date the latest version that you have. And we thought it might be convenient if you have this now. Some are things we've already discussed. Some are things which are going to come up in Saved by the Bell.
Sorry.
About the main mods.
This list of new main mods, basically. Do you want them now? Do you want them some other time? This is not a new, it's just some additional ones, not new ones. It's not another version of the document you already have. It's some additional ones which have arisen out of the discussions that we've had thus far, and one or two which we'll be introducing, some this afternoon, some in other sessions.
Okay.
Fine. Yes. It's just that there's one in particular which we'll be talking about this afternoon, which we wanted to make sure that you had decent sight of. Yeah.
Sorry, I just gave away my copy here, so I've got a copy in front of me now. That's right. I've got a copy now. So, yeah, basically, obviously, we page numbered it. So on page 1, there was an issue around basically the geographical area. There's other. So on page 1, there's a map which basically replaces a map in the submission version of the local plan, and all that's doing is basically identifying the South Hampshire urban areas, because that came up in discussion. There's issues on page 2, which we'll discuss this afternoon about concept master plans, but we'll come on to that this afternoon, but we wanted to make sure you're aware of that. It's main modification 14, which has been slightly amended. There's other main modifications we moved through, and there's some on biodiversity, which obviously we'll come on to on Friday. Some in the historic environment section, which we'll come on to, which have been further comments from Historic England. And there's one this morning, which is obviously main modification MM90 on page 6, which is basically to do with purpose-built student accommodation, which is suggesting deleted criteria, which is one of your questions. And then there's some relating to Sir John Moore Barracks. You recall, Mum, that we discussed about the 900 and the working assumption. We thought that wasn't very helpful. So we've included the clarity of that. So it's working through. So this is kind of it's a working note of changes to it. We have updated the main modifications document, but we thought it'd be helpful to actually just produce it as a standalone document and to be guided by you in terms of how you want to receive it.
Yeah.
It's this morning, this afternoon. Yeah.
That have my version and it is that's an addendum to.
It's a kind of supplementary, if I could call it that, to a supplementary to your running version. Yes, my colleague Rosie behind us will email its programme officer. This the 14A from memory. Yeah.
Yes, we should just perhaps say that we did give informal notice yesterday, I think, to those who are most directly affected by the main modification that is being considered this morning. So it's not completely new to it. Yes. You see Mr. Marici nodding vigorously, I would say, to confirm that fact. No.
Madam, you referred to H9, which is one of the issues on which I'm representing the trust, the City of Winchester Trust today. I haven't seen that main modification. I'm not sure. I recently listened.
So
We can provide yeah. I mean, one could perhaps inform participants now it's a very simple modification, simply to remove in its entirety criterion 5, little Roman 5, from policy H9. Just to say, we've got a couple of new team members this morning for you. They'll introduce themselves as appropriate. Perhaps when they come to contribute, they can introduce themselves.
Yes, so the plan sets out a certain level of housing development that has been discussed in previous sessions, and that council believes has been brought forward in light of that government drive for a boost to supply of housing. It's the job of the plan to then set out how that identified housing requirement will be met. There is some flexibility in the way the plan is constructed, for instance, with the exceptions policy and community-led aspects of it. But ultimately, the plan should also give certainty to when development would and would not be appropriate, and in particular with regards to the settlement boundaries. Therefore, we think that it shouldn't just be a criteria based. There should be some certainty for communities and applicants, for all parties, as to when development would be appropriate. And we think that this is the policy, along with policy SP3, which then refers to the rural exceptions policy and in particular the community-led approach for housing schemes, the largest of which the example you'll be aware of is the Ravenswood application and scheme at Knoll that had came forward a previous version of this approach. So it shows that development can come forward of a scale under that approach. On the odd occasion that they do come forward, it provides the appropriate balance between growth and certainty. Yeah, we think that it's a proportionate response. So there's some flexibility here, but so there is some scope where opportunities arise for additional growth, but ultimately the plan should set out how that need will be met and where development is and isn't appropriate, and that's where we're at. taking paragraph 82 first, we have obviously, I should have mentioned, and there is obviously also the scope for neighbourhood plans to come forward as part of the overall development strategy that will be informed by their own local evidence. And obviously there are some neighbourhood plans have a housing target that we've discussed in previous sessions. But as well, in terms of local needs, community-led housing that I've outlined in the previous discussions, that's actually under H4 and come forward in where there is an identified local community need and a will to bring that forward. There's also the rural exception sites policy, H7, to bring that to enable schemes that meet those local needs to deliver. So we think that H2 is well met in that regard. Yes. Paragraph 83. I think we've got through the distribution and development, there is larger rural settlements, and then intermediate rural settlements have been allocated with a level of housing we believe commensurate with the level of services in that centre. For smaller settlements, we do not have allocations, but the infill policy, particularly in sites in settlements that don't have a boundary, does provide that flexibility for smaller works. I think the other thing I would say is that in 83, there's this talk about village potentially assisting the services of another. Well, development can support services. What I would say, however, is that with our workings of the rural exceptions sites schemes, we are explicitly now, and we'll cover that later, but there is a main modification to ensure that needs arising in more than one settlement in that area can then be used as justification to support a rural exceptions scheme coming forward. So there is it's not just a settlement on its own basis, which enables that sort of more general need that maybe too small arising, etc. Yes, which is frankly bringing the policy into line with our understanding and experience of these schemes in the past. And with 84, I think the main thing to add there really, which I haven't mentioned before, is that there is bespoke policy on agricultural workers' dwellings in the countryside, which is we don't bring forward many homes through it, but it is there as a mechanism for identified need where the circumstances arise, without obviously to try and ensure, however, that we don't just end up with isolated dwellings across the countryside. But if there's a locational need for them in a specific rural area, then they can come forward.
Okay, so there's a reading that on H7, H8.
And H11, yeah.
Yes, for rural, sorry, for economic growth, yes. Yeah. It's just that judgment call on getting the balance right. We're conscious you've asked this question, we've had this discussion with regards to SP3 in an earlier matter, and on balance, we think that actually having a settlement boundary and having some reasonable level of certainty as to what can come forward is the appropriate way for us. The alternative is to have a criteria-based policy, looking at sites to come, allowing schemes on the edge to come forward. But I think what you could end up there is quite clearly a sort of an ongoing process of sprawl that could come forward as consolidation of maybe perhaps less dense development on the outskirts of settlements becomes infilled and grown more. That is one way of doing it, but we think that a better way, more certain way, is to allocate sites through the plan, through a plan-led process, to see where the most suitable sites are to come forward and the best locations for settlements to grow. So the plan does set out, forgive me, I'll just check the reference here. So on page 220 of the plan, so paragraphs 9.25 and then table H3, it sets
Sorry,
out.
could you, sorry, what's that reference?
Forgive me, I wasn't speaking into the microphone. So it's
I
page
have mine on. Apparently.
page 220 of the plan, and paragraph 9.25 sets out a narrative on delivery of water sites and then a table there. So what we have there is basically putting completions to one side in the table, because I know that's a live issue, if you like, that you're currently considering looking at previous development. But we're still looking at planning consents and then windfall to come forward. We think we can clearly demonstrate that we're achieving smaller sites. The requirement in the MPPF for over 10% of our development to come forward on smaller sites. I should just say, to add to that, if you look at the windfall background paper, it does explicitly exclude larger sites from those windfall trends coming forward. And then the Sheila itself identifies in Appendix B of the Sheila identifies a large number of over 130 sites that are less than 1 hectare. So I think we've got sufficient grounds to think that the small sites are there. We think the windfall study doesn't show that small sites are drying up. If anything, it's showing that the small sites are quite consistent. It's the large sites that come and go. They're the outliers, if you like. And therefore, we think that we're not in a position, for instance, that other authorities have been where they have included it, because their evidence has shown that they don't have, you know, the small sites are drying up. We're not seeing that in our evidence, and therefore, specifically on the small site, we don't see the need for that to drive a change along the lines that's being suggested.
Okay. Just how does this policy relate to, for example, NE7? That's the settlement gaps.
Well, the best NE7 still applies, so settlement gaps. Obviously, the plan would be read as a whole. But if I can use an example, the Ravenswood scheme was
Sorry, which scheme?
Sorry, the Ravenswood scheme,
Yes.
which is that allocation KN1 now. That was also in the settlement gap under the adopted plan and the adopted policy. But that planning application, as it progressed through, you know, a community-led scheme, considering the impacts on the scheme, in those circumstances, the strategic gap designation did not prevent that scheme from coming forward and winning approval. So it doesn't mean that gap policy doesn't apply. It clearly does, but a decision can be taken in those circumstances should a site come forward.
I understand. So read the plan as a whole. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Could I open it up to those around the table, please? Sorry, when you put your nameplate up, would you mind turning it towards me so I can see who it is? Ms. Cahill?
Hello. I apologise for being very nervous. I've never been to anything like this before. I just want to respond to the fact that I didn't hear what the council say, but there is no flexibility in this policy. And what they're admitting is small sites, which lie, infill sites in particular, which lie adjacent to or very close to a settlement boundary. These sites are are generally in very sustainable locations by their location, but they're currently being refused because they have no policy to actually cover them. So by their very nature, they're being placed in the countryside. When they're not in the countryside, they form an intrinsic part of a settlement. And I do have an example here to just demonstrate with one particular site, which I'm happy to.
No, if you
hand
just
over.
explain,
Okay.
if you just explain it.
Well,
that's
basically, you've got a site here which the road has been put outside the development boundary, adjoining the development boundary. It contains a ribbon of 13 houses, and in the middle of that is one small infill site. That is refused planning because it is placed in the countryside, yet it's in a sustainable location. It's probably closer to the village, that settlement centre, than the outlying green edges of the settlement that go that way rather than that way. So it's refused. It's not in the countryside, yet it gets pushed into all these countryside policies, and it is part of that settlement. So NPPF 83 is calling for opportunities for villages to grow and thrive. That's an opportunity, but it's being completely overlooked. And I've been through the Sheila document, and I can find sites all over Winchester like this, and they're all being treated the same way. They are not being given the flexibility because of this lack of policy for infill that is just outside settlement boundaries. I mean, literally, you're talking about meters here from the settlement boundary, putting it in countryside. I mean, all these small sites, they can't come forward as windfall because the policies do not allow them to do that. They just get treated as countryside and not considered as windfall. Yet they can make a valuable contribution, these small sites, because they're built out quickly. They use all local developers using local trades. They will contribute to the local economy. So the fact you've not got them is not actually helping. I mean, paragraph 68 says that small and medium sites can make an important contribution and are built up relatively quickly. That's exactly what these sites would fulfil. And the value of these small sites is recognised by other planning authorities. And you can find a number that have policies that cover small infill sites outside or adjacent to settlement boundaries. And in particular, neighbouring Fareham Borough Council or District Council have a specific policy which is new small-scale development outside urban areas. And that provides a sensible example for small infill sites outside a development boundary. And what I'm asking you to consider is inclusion of such a policy as part of this H4 for small infill sites outside but close to a development boundary. And this allows the promotion and use of a valuable source of small infill sites, which is supported by Winchester's planners.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Cahill. Chamber of Commerce, please. Mr. Joseph.
Am I switched on? I switched on. That's good. I've spoken to Miss Cahill and I've tried to explain to her the planning policies. And as you can tell from Mr. Ayling, you have to go and see him to get an explanation of what the policy actually means. And it's the only way, because it's so blooming complicated that no normal person will understand it. That can't be the basis for a policy. Now, the one way of getting around it, and I've spoken to Mr. Cahill about that, is to go for a self-build plot, because that gets through the system. And across the road from her site, there's a plot called Ash Tree Bunkers Hill, Denmead, opposite side of the road. And the way that one went through, proposed erection of a replacement dwelling, and then they converted it to a self-build. So it goes into the self-build list as a self-build plot, but it's a replacement dwelling, and it's been permitted. It's not the only one. So you actually have a two-tier situation. So the chamber is very not enough housing is for the 1 hectare sites under paragraph 69 or stroke 70, because for builders, they're not getting enough sites. If you go down to 0.5 of a hectare, there's an exemption for self-build, and across the whole of the council, self-build are going through. So the next one is 100 acres in Wickham, replacement dwelling described as self-build. I don't know the answer, but I believe the reason is it's a means of getting a bigger house and not paying sill. But why is it in the self-build list? Why is the council publishing documents that shouldn't be there? It's not the only one. Some of them are out in the countryside. So if you go for something like Forest Lane.
We will, sorry, can I just interrupt? We will be dealing with self-build under policy, the next policy, isn't it, H5. Are your concerns regarding self-build?
Well, I have got concern, but the principal concern for the chamber
Okay.
is the gap between 0.5 and a hectare. Those sites are not coming forward, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, you've heard what's been said. Do you have anything to say, the point that Ms. Kyle took up about the criteria for sites just outside? Do you have anything else to say on that? Don't repeat what you've already said.
I hear what she's saying, and I hear the reference to a neighbouring authority that has that small sites. That plan explicitly does say that that's to bring forward to make good a shortfall in the number of small sites coming forward, rather than to boost supply. And we feel that, as set out in page 220 of the plan, we're looking at about 16% of the numbers as written at that point of the total housing development coming forward on small sites. So we think it's there. Otherwise, we're back to discussions about sprawl and all the rest of it that you've heard and Ms. Cahill's heard.
Okay. Do you have anything? You've heard what the Chamber of Commerce has said, those concerns?
I think it's really just the nature of some of the small build properties that have come forward. If schemes meet the criteria for self-build, they should be recorded as such. And in fact, I think probably we haven't been as good as recording actual self-build properties in the past as we might have been. But if it's a replacement dwelling, obviously you're in a different position with regards to a planning application and planning policy, rather than for the development. I don't think there's anything else I want to add at this point.
Okay. Okay.
Can I just make, I did miss one point. Lack of this policy about infill in outside or close to development boundaries is being used by parish councils in their neighbourhood plans to prevent sites coming forward, because what they're saying is Winchester doesn't have a policy covering this, because this policy only covers sites that have no settlement boundary. It says what you should do and that you can have infill with no settlement boundary. It does not say what you can do with infill that's just close to the border. And then the parish council's then saying, oh, there's no policy, so we can't allocate that site. They're using it as a reason not to allocate sites. The other point I would just make about self-build is that site in Denmead has been put forward previously for self-build and refused because it is in the countryside. Nothing to do with self-build. So self-build will still get rejected on the basis, even though it is an intrinsic part of the settlement.
Okay, thank you. Chamber of Commerce, do you want to say anything on?
Yes, I do. I just want to come back on another point, madam, and that is my understanding in terms of developments close to the boundary of a settlement is there is some resistance to releasing them because they enable the area to expand illegally, as it were, contrary to policy. And that's one of the reasons being given here and at Whiteley. Mr. Oberchik said that.
Any response, Mr. Ray?
I think we're still really talking about the potential for sprawl, if you like, you know, of the intensification of existing outlying areas to settlements, and then the judgment call is whether that's appropriate or not. We're
Okay. Thank you. I'll come to my conclusions on that. I don't think we've got any MMs on H4. Is there anything in the new document? I don't think so. Okay. Okay, let's move on, please. H5. So this policy sets out requirements for the size mix and tenure of housing to meet local housing needs, and it sets out percentages, 40% of affordable housing and the size, 3 beds or more, 65% affordable home ownership, 2 and 3 beds. Sorry, I should have said 40% affordable housing for rent, 3 beds or more, 65% affordable home ownership, 2 or 3 beds, 30% market housing, 1 and 2 beds. And you provide a justification for that. And of course, those are all at least figures, aren't they? So could I just ask you about those figures, where they're derived from, first of all, and whether they provide adequate flexibility? Please, can I turn to the council first of all?
Yes, good morning, Mum. My name's Nick Ireland. I'm a director at a consultancy called IC, and we prepared some of the council's housing needs evidence in the 2020 SHMAR and the 2024 SHMAR update, which are HA01 and HA02. So I think in terms of this and the size mix and tenure profile of or size mix of different tenures of housing,
Sorry, would you mind speaking into your microphone?
Sorry, is that better?
Yeah,
I'll bring it a little bit closer.
I'm not doing such a good job, but I don't think the acoustics are that good with the air conditioning. Do carry on, Mr. Wright.
Yes, the core evidence and the evidence base underpinning the policy is in the SHMAR updates. That's HA01, and particularly section 4 of that, which looks at a range of factors, including the existing housing mix, issues around overcrowding, occupancy, demographic change over the plan period, the housing register, and the lettings profile, and that is used to derive some recommendations in terms of the mix of housing, which is set out, I think, in tables 411 and 412. Table 411 in particular of that document. I think the question that's coming out of the representations on this matter is really one of flexibility. And I think the way I would summarise this is there's flexibility in a number of ways. Firstly, this applies to major schemes only, so it's schemes of 10 or more dwellings. And that's what's set out in the policy text in policy H5. Secondly, you see other local plan policies which put in the policy wording a specific table with percentages that are applicable to specific sizes of dwellings, 1, 2, 3, 4 bed. This policy doesn't do that, and it sets out broad parameters for a minimum percentage for certain sizes. And so if you look at if I take market housing as an example, rather than X% 1 bed, X% 2 bed, you've got at least 30% 1 or 2 bed. And so the way I think the policy is phrased and the wording of the policy introduces a level of flexibility in itself. That's the second aspect. The third aspect of this is just looking carefully at the wording above those points 1, 2, and 3, and the policy itself sets out that those should be applied unless evidence of local need or the circumstances of the site justify an amended approach. So I'm about halfway down the left-hand column in the policy. And you can see the wording there, unless evidence of local need or the circumstances of the site justify an amended approach. And so there is flexibility built into the wording of the policy to take account of site-specific factors, such as the site's location, the area character, and so forth.
Okay, I've got that. And in terms of small buildings, okay, market housing, small dwellings, 1 and 2 beds.
Yes. In terms of, well, that's dealt with in bullet point 3. At least 30% of market housing should be 1 or 2 bedroom
Just tell
properties.
me the justification for that.
That's consistent with the SHMA recommendations in table 414 in the SHMA, which shows focus of demand really on family-sized homes, which is reflected in this policy. So, I mean, it's at least 70%, but equally you could see, so at least 30%. Equally, the balance there, 70%, is delivering. It is potentially up to 70% is delivering family-sized homes with 3 or more bedrooms.
Yeah, okay, so that's to meet a local identified need, and that's justified in the SHMA.
Correct.
Yeah, okay, I've got that. Let me just move the other points I want to pick up on is specialist housing, optional technical standards, and self-build, custom build. Just before I go on to that, is there anything that anyone wants to contribute to what the council has just said on the size mix? Okay, let me move on then to specialist. So I suspect it's Mr. Ireland again. What does the SHMA say about need, and what's recent supply been? What's the supply?
Thank you. Yes, the SHMA update, so H001,
Yeah.
Assesses need in section 5. And you can see, I refer you particularly to table 5.7 within that document, which sets out the need over the plan, over the plan period, for different types of specialist housing, housing with support, housing with care, which is like extra care accommodation, as well as residential and nursing care bed spaces. And it identifies both a current position in net terms and a need over the plan period. I think how I broadly characterise that is of a relatively modest need for housing with support, and that reflects the strong existing supply that we see within the district. A need for housing with care, but if you read the chapter as a whole, as well as the previous assessment, I think it's fair to characterise Winchester as a fairly proactive authority in terms of bringing forward extra care schemes. It's delivered schemes in the past. There were schemes in Winchester, and indeed it has a pipeline supply as well. And then it works through also a need for residential and nursing care bed spaces, particularly over the plan period, reflecting demographic change. So we then see a policy position in H5, which is.
So what you're saying, that you've got a strong existing supply, you've got a need, you've got a strong existing supply. You're saying the council are proactive.
Correct.
And is it meeting that need?
Yes, I mean, I think if I talk through how the plan is approaching this, you both have H5 in terms of supportive policy encouraging provision on major sites 50+ units, But then we've seen extra care schemes delivered in Winchester in recent years. There are planning consents on key strategic site allocations for extra care development. So Kings Barton, North Whiteley and the Newlands or West Waterlooville scheme, as well as an allocation of the Cart and Horses site in Kingsworthy. And then I think if you read the policy H5 alongside, for instance, the policies looking at some of the mixed-use regeneration areas, Station Approach, the University and Royal Hampshire Hospital site, those are also encouraging provision on those on those opportunities. So I think we both have a position where the council and the county council have been working together to bring forward development, and that you can see that both in historical delivery and the pipeline position looking forwards.
Okay, so you've heard what the concern is. It's the concern that actually that's a passive approach, that you haven't got a bespoke policy that will bring forward specialist housing. What do you say to that, please?
The concern in the representations of the master statement that I read was suggested that the only supply coming forward was the Cart and Horses site.
Sorry,
the only supply was the Cart and Horses site in Kingsworthy. And the suggestion in that representation was that almost that was it from the plan. And that's not the case, because those strategic allocations have all got existing planning consents where the county council and the council have worked together and include provision for schemes in the pipeline already. And equally, there is further potential, for instance, in the mixed-use regeneration areas. So I think it's almost misinterprets slightly what the plan is already achieving.
Okay, so those are, you're referring to the site allocations, but what about the policy framework? Should there be a bespoke policy that is bringing forward and supporting specialists and supported housing? Mr. Ayling?
If I may, thank you. I mean, policy H5 does have a general encouraging presumption for specialist and supported housing throughout. Yes, we have mentioned allocations as well. Where appropriate opportunities have arisen, we've allocated that in the plan, as well as bringing forward those rolled forward permissions on those old MDAs at West Waterlooville and Whiteley and Kings Barton. So we think at the moment we're in a pretty good place with regards to having the framework and the supply of this type of accommodation. As Mr. Ireland said, there will be an ongoing need going forward, but it's not acute and it's not with us now. We've identified the sites that we think that are appropriate, and we have an expectation we have a permissive policy here for new schemes when we come forward. So we think on balance that the policy's in an appropriate place.
Okay. Does anybody wish to say anything? Mr. Warrener?
Thank you, ma'am. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Thank you. You've picked up some of my questions within our responses already, so I'm not going to repeat that. I think the difference here is that, well, firstly, you know, the MPPF and the practice guide is quite clear as to identifying specific needs. I take the point that the council obviously are allocating or proposing they come forward with sites which are larger than 50 units. We do think that is passive. I hear the response that they think the pipeline is significant enough to accommodate that supply, but I don't think that's correct. We're not aware of a pipeline which does meet this. I mean, if you look at the graph in HO1, which was 5.7, which Mr. Ireland referred to.
Sorry, what are you referring to?
Table 5.7 in the SHMA update report, HO01. You know, there's quite a significant amount of shortfall being shown within that table. that would require, a significant amount of pipeline, which we don't think there is. There is the allocation site of 80 units within Kingsworthy. We accept that. But a lot of this, it seems quite ad hoc. And what we are trying to refer to within our representations is that, the government's focus on this. I mean, if you look at, I take you whilst you've got HO1 up, Marm, if you look at, find it, table figure 9.1 on page 59.
Figure 9.1.
Yeah, you can see the population change within the borough, and this, the significant change within the demographic is all 65 plus population growth. It's the big driver of additional housing requirements. And we calculate that there's a requirement of around 998 additional homes of people's houses. We think, it's quite important that that is identified within the plan, and that total can be measured in terms of its delivery. And at the moment, policy H5 doesn't allow that. Now, coming back to the ad hoc point, the government obviously is very concerned about the impacts of an ageing population on the current supply of housing. It commissioned the Mayhew report, which we refer to within our response. But the key takeaways from that, there are 11.2 million people 65 plus today. It's expected to increase to 17.2 million by 2040. On current trends, the vast majority will live in standard housing. Well, as many as 6.2 million will live alone, and half of that will be aged 80 plus. And the concern is the effect will pile pressure on the existing care services and social care system. So it doesn't just advocate the delivery of additional elder people's houses, specialist housing. It also advocates the delivery of integrated retirement communities, kind of larger retirement centres, because they include 24/7 staffing, they include cultural facilities and services, and they reduce the need for local care. So it's about, providing specialist housing in a way that avoids placing further pressure on the local services and facilities. And this policy doesn't do that at the moment. It's passive. It's requiring schemes to deliver an element. It doesn't say how big that element should be. It deliver an element of specialist housing. And I don't think that will fulfill the requirements of national policy. I don't think it's an effective policy as it is. I think there needs to be a specific amount afforded to specialist housing within the policy. So, as I say, they can measure the delivery of it. They may say they've got a pipeline. We haven't seen delivery in the recent AMR report saying that they're delivering specialist housing. That's why we say that there is a significant shortfall within. We think that there should be a view as to how they can accommodate integrated retirement accommodation. So a more holistic proposition rather than ad hoc extra care or care homes, detached from services, etc. And that's what we're saying this policy should do. Now, we are saying that there is a site available to deliver an integrated retirement community, but I know that's not for now.
Okay, thank you very much. Ms Mulliner?
Thank you, Ma'am. Yes, Ms Mulliner for Bargate Homes. I think the problem with this and the lack of flexibility is just borne out by the combined effect of these policies, and it's making the sites, particularly the smaller sites. When I say smaller sites, I mean sites of between sort of 50 and 150 homes. It's working those sites really hard within some inflexible restrictions. So they're working to deliver affordable, self-build and specialist housing on those sites. And then layered on that, the restriction over what percentage is 1 and 2 bedroom homes or what percentage is 3 bedroom homes. It actually means that particularly, I mean, if you work the figures for a site of say 51 homes, actually you've got very, very little flex. By the time you do those affordable, self-build, specialist, and then the layered restriction of how many bedrooms that we've just talked about in terms of the more than 3+ beds for some of the affordable rents and everything, you actually end up with very little ability to actually design something that is suitable for the site. And I know Mr. Ireland has just mentioned the flexibility in the policy to do something else according to site characteristics, but that's according to compelling evidence. So that's quite a high bar actually, just to do good design. Why should it be compelling? This should be about good design. What's
Where
right
are you
for the
getting
site?
compelling evidence?
Sorry, the compelling evidence was back, if you look under the dwelling size and tenure. So it says, unless compelling evidence is provided contrary, proposal should include a reasonable mix of dwellings. And then you have those 1, 2 and 3. Sorry, I'm going back to what we were discussing before, but just because in the round that the effect of that is every site, say 51, 52 units, is trying to do too much according to these policies.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Law, please, Mr. Gately.
Thank you, Marvin. It's just to put the implication of what's just been said is that in order to achieve the aims of this policy, where those different requirements are intended to be met, there is a need to allocate larger sites that are capable of bringing that flexibility. So it's a point that's obviously been raised in previous sessions, but it's worth repeating now that, in order to meet these laudable objectives, to meet the housing needs of all, you simply can't rely on a restricted supply, most of which has already been catered for or consented.
Thank you, Mr. Gately. Ms. Carhill.
On the policy itself, I would like to say I found it a little ambiguous because when it says it's self-build on large sites, it said there must be 6% self-builds. Does that mean 6% of the whole site or 6% of the number over 50 dwellings?
Okay, could I come on to self-build and custom build?
Yes, sure.
We're just dealing
Okay.
with specialists.
Sorry.
Do you have anything to say on specialist? No, thank you. Okay, could I turn to the council?
Just one point from me, Mum, if I may, on the drafting.
Yeah.
Just this point about compelling evidence. One needs to read the words carefully. Compelling evidence is required if the developer seeks to have something which is other than a reasonable mix of dwelling sizes. There's a slightly different test, which is evidence of local needs and so on, triggering the flexibility, which is the core to why this policy works.
Okay, sorry. So it says unless compelling development proposal should deliver a range of types and sizes to meet housing need in accordance with recent evidence, most recent. Unless compelling evidence is provided to the contrary, proposal should include a reasonable mix of dwellings.
Yes.
Okay.
That's where that's where the reference to compelling evidence
Okay,
comes
but
in.
then it goes on for development of 10 dwellings or more. This should include.
Yes.
Now, is that the compelling evidence should include? This should include the following, unless evidence of local needs or circumstances.
No, I think this should include relates back to the reasonable mix of dwelling sizes. I think that's the natural reading of it, isn't it?
Yeah, okay. Thank you for that. Okay, could I turn to the council, please? You've heard what's been said regarding the flexibility in particular.
That's fine. If I may, I'll start with the policy as drafting issues, if you like, and then Mr. Ireland will pick up on some detailed points.
Yeah, and
from the lead.
yes, and also the points that's been made about the need for a specific policy that and the monitoring of that policy, particularly, sets out what the need is for supported, and then that needs to be monitored and delivered. If you could deal with the 2 points, please.
Yes, sure. So I think the way this is worded on specialist and supported housing, taking that time, I think it's a little more than just passive. There is a presumption, there is a permissive approach to development, but actively requiring schemes over 50 dwellings to consider how an element of supported housing or housing for older persons may be able to be delivered is not, I would say, it's not just passive. It is actually a quite positive step in requiring to consider the delivery of that sort of accommodation across the plan area. Really, I would say that the requirement here is not. I think it's justified by the needs in terms of what we've identified through the SHMA. And I think that, if I may, it's a small point, but the idea that our current pipeline, which is outlined in paragraph 1.16 of our participant statement, actually totals, for a point of reference, it's 265 units in the schemes outlined in 1.16 for everyone. They're not ad hoc schemes. They've come forward as part of large master plan developments and major development areas, by and large. So they are arising from that larger schemed proposals. Indeed, as Mr. Gately was outlining in terms of what you can get on a larger site. So these are part of integrated into larger schemes, and therefore are appropriate locations for them. It's not just an ad hoc take opportunities where they arise. With regards to setting out a need and a policy for it, we're not sure what that would get you over and above what we've got here. I think we've already allocated the scheme, but we've considered opportunities for allocating sites that are appropriate for older persons and supported housing. You've seen that in the plan. So what we don't think is, by having a separate policy that, or a criteria that sets out a requirement, we're not sure what that would get you in terms of delivery further than what we've got here, which is requiring all sites over a certain size to consider how they might contribute towards that need. So I think that's really where we're at in our thinking with regards to the policy. Would you like to ask any questions, or should I hand over to Mr. Ireland and perhaps we'd answer any further points together?
No, that's okay.
Thank you.
If you hand over.
Thank you. It's just, I think, a few references to your notes. The supply position and pipeline is set out in the council's matters statement in paragraphs 116 and 117. But we've got a supply position of 147 care home bed spaces. We talk in 116 about the extant allocations, and I suppose the position with extra care schemes is there are three existing extra care schemes. There are three more, as Mr. Ayling has talked on those key strategic allocations, which is 60 units at Kings Barton, 65 units at Bearwood, and 60 units at North Whiteley, in addition to the Kingsworthy site. Yes. And so, I mean, you will have been in and I'm sure been in situations, as have I, where there is no pipeline and no existing extra care provision. This is the opposite end of the spectrum. The council has already delivered and manages schemes itself, and working with the county has a pipeline of others, coming forwards, and that combined with the policy encouraging provision, I think should support delivery. I think it's also just worth mentioning that the plan should be read as a whole. And as we've as I've set out at 116, there are references in other areas in regeneration areas in Winchester City to encouraging provision in those types of location on those sites as well.
Okay, thank you. Okay, quickly.
Thank you, Mum. Sorry, just to come back on the point about the compelling evidence. For me, that policy definitely reads compelling evidence for a reasonable mix. This, i.e. the reasonable mix, should include, and then the list. So I think if it's to be read in the way the council just explained, that needs to read, this could, as a starting point or as an indicative mix, and then you can read it and interpret it in the way it's just been mentioned. But at the moment, compelling evidence, reasonable mix, this, i.e. the reasonable mix, should include. So that compelling evidence is definitely linked to that list of things. I don't see how you can read it in any other way unless it's very clear that that list of percentages as a indicative starting point.
Okay, thank you.
Just
Mr.
very
Warner?
quickly, thank you for the responses. I take the point about the supply which has been made, but it still doesn't add up to the requirement of 998 homes. I mean, you talked about the 265, 60, 65 and 60, but that's still a long way short. So the SHMA requires, from my understanding, 620 extra care, 800 care or nursing home spaces. So, you know, there's quite a significant amount. I do think it would be much more effective if you pulled the specialist housing from that policy, similar point to what Ms. Milner was saying, and had a policy which said this is the amount, put the supply, if there is a supply, to show how that is meeting the 998 homes or whatever, so that it's quite clear to us that the specialist housing is being met. But we don't think it is from what the evidence has been provided.
Okay, heard what you said. Mr. Ayling?
If I can just say briefly on the comment on the dwelling size and tenure mix, apologies, but we've gone around a few times on this, I know, but the second paragraph of it, I don't understand what the issue is, frankly. The second sentence, it does talk about compelling evidence, but it just then says a reasonable mix of dwelling sizes. Then it says the next sentence, for development of 10 dwellings or more, this should include the following unless evidence of local needs or circumstances. So the compelling evidence relates to having a reasonable mix of sizes. Then we then set out for larger schemes what a mix is expected unless there is evidence of local needs or the circumstances of the site. So I won't labour it anymore.
Okay, can you address the other point that's been made? You've heard it again. If you don't have anything to say, that's fine. I don't mind who answers.
Yes, Mum. The needs position for extra care is 540, not I think a figure.
I'm okay on the
yeah,
needs.
You're fine on the
I'm okay
on the supply position. The schemes that that we've just described, which are the specific allocation in Kingsworthy and the 3 consent schemes is a pipeline supply of 265, and then so we have a specific supply on those schemes, but then the policies of the plan read as a whole would be expected to support other schemes coming forwards, both on other allocated sites. There's no requirement in national policies to make specific allocations for extra care, both other sites in the plan and windfalls.
Okay, Mr. Ayling, do you have anything more to say on the proposal for a bespoke policy?
Nothing to add, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to optional standards. optional technical standards. Could I just ask on what evidence is this based, please? The requirement for optional standard.
Yes, M42 or M43 or both? Or you're talking about space standards?
All of them. Yeah.
Okay. If I look at M42 and M43, the evidence is in the SHMA update. That is showing that 28.5% of households have somebody with a disability, and as table 5.5 sets out, those with mobility problems are expected to grow substantially, with an increase of about 6,800 over the plan period. And that provides a clear justification for accessible and adaptable homes in a context where nationally about just 7% of homes meet those standards. For context, that's also been considered within the viability evidence, and I think it's also material that the government is intending to mandate that in due course through changes to building regulations. So the position in terms of a planned policy on this is almost an interim position pending that change to building regs.
Yeah. Okay.
In terms of M43 wheelchair accessible homes, again, the evidence is in the SHMA H01. And for your notes, the relevant section there is starting on paragraph 5.41. That is showing a need for around 414 wheelchair user homes over the plan period, with a higher incidence in affordable housing than market. Again, that policy has been considered and built into the viability evidence. With the policy responding to that, I think looking at 5% provision of wheelchair accessible homes for market housing and 10%. 5% for market housing, and 10% on affordable.
For affordable, yeah.
For major schemes, as set out in H5.
Yeah, and then you've got some flexibility with regards to M43.
Yes.
So it's all new homes. Yeah. Mr. Ayling?
If I may, I think you wanted a few words on space standards as well.
Please.
So the participant statement really goes through with if you like, a local justification for achieving nationally described space standards is set out, which is evidence in the employment land study and the Hampshire home movers study, which outlined in paragraph 1.25 of the participant statement here. The employment land study does talk about rates of home working in this area, and the Hampshire home movers survey, which does find that space to work from home within properties may also be an important factor for home movers. So if we're looking for a local justification for why these minimum space standards should be met, there are circumstances in Winchester that point to that. And again, I can confirm that those costs have been included in the viability study work.
It's been subject to viability, yeah. Okay, I'm okay on that. Does anybody want to contribute anything to that? Can I move on to self-build, custom build? Because in the requirements, you refer to that. So the evidence of need, you've taken it from the self-build and custom build register, parts 1 and 2. Is that right?
We have, though I should reference examination document ED10, which is a position statement on self and custom build house building, where there has been some review. There's been a story with our self and custom build housing register, but the document ED10 does set out the composition, and that is the basis on which the policy has been brought forward.
Does that use any secondary sources?
The SHMA does use secondary sources to identify a wider need for custom and self-build housing. The 2020 SHMA did, rather the update did not, as we were going through this process that has resulted in the position statement there. Nonetheless, we have a local connection test in place, so we have in effect two figures, one for planning applications, development management purposes, and one for a wider unmet need that is including those individuals who do not pass a local connection test.
So that's a need of just over 400, isn't it? With 64 with no local connection.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And so the supply is what? 30?
So since self-build was our current number on the register was 400. Sorry, forgive me.
407, I think.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
And since the introduction of self-build, we've permitted 240 in total over that period. But we are currently in a position where we have not fulfilled our obligation to permit the need arising within 3 years, and so that is in play and informing planning decisions that are with us now. This document ED10 is on the council's website and is in effect the council's position on supply and delivery since the introduction of self-build.
So that shows that a shortfall of 231 as of October 24, doesn't it?
Yes.
So, as we've said, you're not meeting the demand for self-build, custom build. Okay, so what's the approach in the policy then?
Yeah.
Larger sites of more than 50 offer plots 6%. 6%, isn't it? Of at least 60% of service when plots for sale for self-build, and then you have some flexibility in terms of 12 months marketing and testing for viability.
Yes,
is that right?
I mean, this is trying to, and first of all, I can confirm that the 6% is intended to apply to the total number of dwellings. So I think there was a question raised earlier about that. So we're talking of 3 plots in our notional 50 dwelling scheme. I mean, it's just trying to be proportionate here in terms of, we think that we are catching up, if you like, with our need that's built up on self and custom build housing. We're seeing an improvement in our figures for delivery. I think part of that, frankly, is due to better recording. We relied on SIL reports, SIL records rather, since the introduction of self-build. Now the biodiversity net gain exemption and frankly, this us now resulting in not meeting our requirements. We're more focused and better at recording those self-build properties as and when they come through. But we do think that the policy does need to do something more, and that's where this requirement for an element on larger schemes come. We know that some parties are saying there should be a bespoke, if you like, exceptions policy for self-build. We are concerned about that because we have long had a rural exceptions scheme in Winchester that has delivered additional affordable housing sites, and the figures are in the participant statement, that we think would be absolutely brought at risk because of if a self-build exceptions policy was brought in, because our understanding is that values of self-build plots are higher than can be secured through a rural exception scheme. So that's our thinking.
Sorry, that was one of my questions. So the reason for that is because the values.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's our understanding from our viability consultants, and is indeed sort of set out in the viability study. So given the risk to our rural exceptions schemes, we're now in this. We're following this approach of requiring an element on larger sites. We think, looking at the figures, that this should deliver enough over the plan period with our increased expectations on positions.
It's likely to bring forward 153, and then you're taking into account windfall.
Yes.
So that's your supply to meet.
It is, yeah. So over the plan period, we think we'll get there with regards to our, the the delivery and the need by 2040 will be in sync, will match.
Okay, and you've got various different scenarios for windfall, haven't you? Can you just explain why you've chosen the one that you've chosen? Scenario C, I think.
Yes, sure. So we've looked at various windfall rates, some from the introduction of self-build as in 2016, and frankly, yes, the rates of new entrants on the register were higher in those earlier years, but have tailed off quite significantly in the last 3 or 4 years. We think that's been consistent enough, though, that we think it's a basis on which to expect that we don't continue to see the high level of increase of need on the register. Frankly, we think that as people understand more what self-build is, certainly in terms of the applicants who come to us to go on the register, they'll ask to join a register, and in not all cases, but in many cases, will then say, when do I hear about my plots? And I think that understanding of the limitations of being on the register is playing out in a reduction in more recent years in the number of people joining it, and of course does not limit people from buying and delivering a self-build plot, whether they're on the register or not. In terms of supply, as I've said, we think that in recent years, again, there are 3 scenarios looking at the permissions granted across the period since 2016, all focusing on more recent years. And as I said, because of a number of reasons, we think we haven't really recorded maybe as many self-build permissions in the past as we might have done. But we are where we are with our position. But we think that better recording is reflecting in a higher average rate in more recent years. Biodiversity net gain is one clear way that we can that is a clear incentive for applicants to properly record that whether a plot is self-build, and indeed our understanding and working with the legislation, we're now putting measures in place to ensure, for instance, that plan application descriptions properly record that this is a self-build, because we're not meeting our need. It's in applicants' interest to make sure that that's properly set out, so that then the council's shortfall at present can play out in planning decisions.
Okay, thank you for that. That's answered a number of my questions. Tell me the threshold. So you've got on sites more than to support self-build and custom builds on sites of 50 dwellings or more should offer 6%. How did you hit upon the 6%?
There's no study. It's really a judgment decision on what is reasonable. We had the opportunity to test this through the Regulation 18 decision. So Regulation 18 consultation. 50 homes has come from a sort of size of scheme where you're actually on site for more than 12 months. So there's a reasonable amount of time to market a self-build plot, and 6% is really just looking at a figure to deliver a meaningful, cumulatively meaningful, but not too onerous level of development. And frankly, the thought that 3 plots on a site of 50 homes shouldn't be too difficult to market and see the demand in that location where a scheme is coming forward. It has been, I would say that the responses to the Regulation 18, there were a number of, obviously we received some objections and people seeking a criteria-based policy purely for the self-build, but a number of promoters and site developers frankly said they could live with it, given the flexibilities that are built in. After 12 months marketing, it falls away, and that sort of thing. And I think one of the participants here made the point that really we're probably more talking in this scenario of more a custom build plot rather than a self-build plot, which meets the same need in terms of our description, because in practical terms, that's almost certainly going to be more the route that is taken, and I accept that. I don't think necessarily policy needs changing. the wording needs to change, but we accept that it's more likely to be a custom build plot coming through under this policy than an actual self-build project managed scheme.
Okay, thank you for that. Could I just ask anybody else, Ms. Carhill?
Thank you. I'm not quite clear on when they say about, I still find it ambiguous about the 6% over on sites over 50, because you've just mentioned that a site of 50 would produce 3 self-built plots. So we talk about the whole site, or are you talking about if you've got a site of 100 homes, it's the 50 homes over the extra 50 that causes the self-build, which would, if it's the whole site of 100 that's 6%, it's 6 homes. I don't really, it's not clear to me which bit of it you know, if you've got a site of 50 homes or 49 homes, are there no self-build plots? But on a site of 50 homes, you'd have 3 self-build plots. Right, so on a site of 100 homes, you'd have 6 self-build plots. Okay. I think
I'm clear on that point. Okay. Is there anything else?
Yeah, I wanted to say, this doesn't mention at all small sites being used for self-build. And people that want to self-build generally want to build on small sites. They don't actually want to have a site that's part of a big development. But I would say that the council's shown a shortfall in self-build, but they're not considering these, as I've already mentioned, small infill sites that are parts of settlements that just happen to lie slightly on the wrong side of a boundary. That could be an exception in this policy to allow for self-build. It wouldn't actually create sprawl, because we're talking about a small site. We're not talking about loads of sites in that area. We talk about infill, which is between existing dwellings, and using those to help fulfil this need that they've got a shortfall.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Mulliner?
Thank you, Mum. I agree with that. I think most people that want to have a self or custom build actually don't want to live on a housing estate, which is effectively what it is. But setting that aside, I think it's useful to hear the acceptance that most of, particularly on 50 house sites, it would be custom build plots. But equally, when you think about the kind of build of that, if you're marketing, say, a custom build for 12 months, realistically, that actually means that the developer could well be on and off site by that time. So it is a bit of a problem, that 12-month period. And given the list is already there, the need is already there, and people are saying, hang on, I'm going on the register, where's my plot? I don't see why that shouldn't be shortened to 6 months, which would allow then a custom build to be taken into account and built as part of the build, rather than something that a developer may have to come back and bring the team back on site to build just 3 plots. So it's just it's that timing, the practicalities of building.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Mulliner. Chamber of Commerce?
Thank you, Madam. I mentioned previously that I couldn't quite understand the policy. And if you haven't made an exhaustive search of the list of self-build, but I've found several where they're replacement dwellings, and I haven't understood how a replacement dwelling fulfills the criteria for self-build. And one of them is pretty extreme. It's in the countryside. Consent is sought to replace the existing dwelling 5-bedroom property of approximately 345 square metres for a replacement to 600 square metres. There's a palace. How did that get through as a replacement in the self-build list? And that goes for others. So there's several that are replacements. So I ask the council, how did a replacement get into the self-build? I mean, you don't need any more in the list because it's already at 240, okay, but it should be accurate.
Can the council just answer that about replacement dwellings?
Yes, we are in a position where replacement dwelling very much can count as self and custom build. The specific definitions of what falls within a self and custom build are not limited, for instance, by size or by the main driver is that the person who is going to live in it and occupies it has a primary role in shaping the design and layout of the building. So they don't have to build it themselves, that's self-build, or manage it themselves. Custom build is of equal status, which means in effect that someone else builds it to their specification, but there's no requirement for it to be of a certain size and or of a modest scale. It just does technically count as self-build. I would say actually that the example you mentioned, which I wouldn't argue with, I'm sure you're correct, demonstrates why we're concerned that we shouldn't be losing the opportunity to deliver rural, exceptional, affordable housing sites at the expense of properties that could be of this sort of nature coming through. That's really our it's helpful to demonstrate that point. Very briefly, a mention was made of the plot, the marketing and all the rest. I think from our perspective, I think you've got to remember that people seeking to acquire plots or to get involved, sometimes there's a need to raise finance. We need to ensure that we've given an appropriate amount of time for marketing to ensure those opportunities are taken up. But marketing of plots doesn't have to start the day development necessarily starts. It could start a little earlier. The plots, what we're talking about is the selling of a service plot, potentially. We don't think that the risk is necessarily there, as has been described, with having sites hanging around, if you like, with undelivered self or custom built plots on it. And our reason for that is the fact that many site promoters have said they can live with the proposals as set out.
Okay, thank you for that. I want to leave that matter there. We're going to take a break now. When we come back, I want to deal with policy H8, H10, H11, H9 in that order, and then I want to deal with policy H6 and H7 together as the last. Don't worry, I'll do it in that order, and I'll say so. When we come back, we'll be dealing with H8, H10, H11, and H9, and then dealing with affordable housing after. Okay, we'll take a break now, and we'll come back at 12 o'clock. Thank you. The time's now 12 o'clock and this session is open. We'll now move on to policy H8. And policy H8 deals with small dwellings in the countryside, and it's aimed to protect the existing stock of small dwellings in the countryside whilst allowing some degree of appropriate enlargement. Is that right? And what you say is, I understand the need to protect small dwellings. You provide that in the evidence. So this 25%, what you say to me is that this has been in an extant plan since 2017. What has happened in practice, please, and has it been effective?
It has been in operation since 2017. That's the date at which if you like, the size of existing dwellings was set. Yeah. Since then, our understanding through DM is the policy has been workable. We have been able to guide development and refuse applications where appropriate and substantiate this. Really, it's been a case that it's still considered to be an appropriate measure. But frankly, having looked at the size of dwelling set in the policy, 120 square meters, is not actually that small, but Mr. Joseph mentioned, you know, we do get some applications for some large dwellings in the
Yeah.
countryside that would be definitely out of the reach of the vast majority of the population. So there is still benefit in retaining it. So that's really where we're at with this policy.
Okay, does anybody wish to say anything on this policy, pick up on any of the points? Are there any suggested MMs for that policy, please?
No.
No. Okay, let's move on, please. Can we move on to policy H10? And this is, sorry, yes, H10. And this is a policy that aims to provide an appropriate mix of housing in areas, and it was prompted reading the evidence by the situation in Stanmore. And what you've done is you've made Article 4 directions to control the change of use from a single dwelling to a house in multiple occupation. And this sets out a statement that you will continue to designate as need arises to restrict those permitted development rights, sorry, and to restrict those changes of use. And then you set out a criteria-based policy which will control those changes of use. So the 20%, no more than 20% in the area as a whole designated area, and 25% in any one street. Just tell me how those figures were arrived at, please. The 20% you say was rolled over, just to cut it, the 20% was rolled over from the extant plan. So I want to know what's been the practice of that and where has the 25% come from, just to focus discussion.
Sure. The 20% was from the rolled over plan, but that was on the back of a report to members on the current position in Stanmore, as was the case in 2016. And that was, if you like, the facts on the ground that we were over 20%, or sorry, we were at 20%, I should say, at Stanmore. And that was getting to the point where there was a concern about balanced and mixed communities over preponderance. So the justification of it really is where we had reached that neighbourhood, which was understood to be the most, like the neighbourhood that was most subject to disturbance and issues arising from an over concentration. So that approach and that threshold has been followed throughout. I think 25% again has been rolled forward. I think it's just purely to give a little more flexibility over that approach of overall 20% up to 25% in any street. But I think that's a judgment call rather than a specific piece of evidence that I can point you to, but that has worked. What you could say really is
sorry, what do you mean it has worked? Is that in the extant plan?
Yes.
Oh, it is.
Yes.
So they're both in the extant plan.
What I mean is it has been, proved to be workable in the adopted plan.
So how many areas roughly have you got? Stanmore is one.
We've got 3 now. So
3 Article 4s.
Yes, Stanmore, Winnell and Chalk Ridge. Winnell in 2018 and Chalk Ridge in 2022. And we say that if there is a concentration result ends up somewhere else, that we'll consider making further Article 4 directions based on the sort of thresholds that we've talked about. You could argue that what we've seen since 2016 is more of a dissipation of HMOs through Winchester into other neighbourhoods considered attractive for HMO occupation, for HMO development, and that's not a bad thing because they're meeting particular housing needs. This is not about stopping HMOs; it's about ensuring there's not an over concentration in any area. Hence the explicit comment that we would consider further Article 4s as required.
Okay, and then you give criteria that is required to guide the conversion of existing dwelling house where suitable, where basically living conditions are seriously compromised due to a concentration of HMOs, and then you give some examples of the sort of evidence that will be required in paragraph 970. So use of the property, evidence should be provided to show why continued use as a dwelling is not realistic and that reasonable attempts to be made to use the property or to use the property as a single family dwelling.
Yes, I mean, it's trying to give some let out really for those property owners or properties that are in a, we don't want to see an over concentration, but if it can be demonstrated that there really isn't a suitable way for certain properties to retain in single occupancy, single household occupancy, then that evidence in 9.70 and indeed criterion 2 of the policy sort of sets out another circumstances where we would consider, if you like, letting another one go to an HMO.
So in 2, you set out what the circumstances might be, and then you in 9.7 you set out what the evidence would be.
Yes.
Marketing evidence. What relevance has that got?
Well, I think if the house has been on the market as for sale as a private residence for a period of time, then that would, and it has not sold because an area was known as being an HMO property and could not be sold as a private residence without a planning application for a change of use, then given the presence of the Article 4 direction, it would need that to go over to HMOs. Then that's really testing the market. To see
and
if
would you have anything that talks about, like you usually do, reasonable price, etc., etc.?
I think, frankly, on reflection, we should have that included in there.
Usually on marketing evidence you have, don't you, for a period of X number of years,
yes,
etc.
We, as is being pointed out, we do talk about a reasonable price. We don't have a time frame, which is a missing part here, frankly. Okay. And I think probably, in fairness, that should be included.
Okay, I'll ask you to look at that, please. Is there anything that anyone would like? Where are my glasses? I think you're all looking blurry, I'm afraid. No, it's fine. Does anybody wish to say anything on that? My glasses. Right, okay. Anyone wish to say anything on that policy? No? Okay, let's move on then, please. Let's move on to policy H11, and this policy deals with housing for agriculture, forestry and other essential rural workers. And what you say is where there's a functional need for a full-time worker taking account of existing accommodation on the unit and in the area, which is the usual type of policy. You say that it should be temporary first of all, before there's evidence that the business is viable, and then you can move on to a permanent dwelling. That's the nub of the policy, isn't it? And it sets out criteria for both permanent and temporary dwellings. First point, equestrian. That's excluded. Is that because of the policy, the NE policy? Equestrian development, equestrian accommodation is specifically excluded, isn't it? Paragraph 980. So you talk about agriculture, forestry and other essential rural workers, and then 9.80 deals specifically with equestrian development. And basically it says it ought to be there at the moment. It ought to be there already. But you do have the NE policy on equestrian development, don't you, anyway? Sorry, I
Yeah.
just want to query that.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, sorry, I was having difficulty hearing myself then. Yeah, so policy unit 12 deals with equestrian development, and if there's a way in which we haven't quite tied this in, then that's done.
Any 12, the phosphate
Needs a cross reference.
Yes.
12.
Is that the reason? Was that the reason? I just want to understand the reasoning behind it.
I believe, obviously in policy H11, towards the end of the policy, we refer to equestrian development. And it's whether or not it would be helpful to signpost to any 12, I think. I think that's your point, Ma'am, but it's difficult because obviously the plan needs to be read as a whole.
Yes,
So
yes, and cross referring,
Yeah.
You're doing that for every policy.
That's right.
Yeah. No,
so
I accept the point. I accept the point. Does anybody have any question on this policy, please? Anything anyone wishes to say? I've looked at the evidence. I don't have any further questions. You do have a main mod on this policy, and this is dealing with heritage. Can you explain that and give me the justification for it? The design of the dwelling should reflect local distinctiveness, rural character surrounding, while avoiding or mitigating adverse effects on the natural or historic environment and biodiversity.
Yeah, this arose from post-submission correspondence with Historic England, who highlighted it as something they would look to see, given where it sits in the policy and the other range of descriptions. Right, it was considered a helpful addition to add to the policy. So it's
And read the whole and all that. I've heard that many times.
Quite, but then frankly, you could say that about all the things listed there in terms of environment, natural environment, biodiversity. If you're going to have that sentence, then historic environment is a helpful addition.
Okay. Hear what you say. Okay, let's move on to PBSA. That is purpose-built student accommodation, and that's policy H9. And don't forget, we've got the suggested if participants could turn that up.
it's on page 6, Ma'am.
Thank you. Okay, so this sets out requirement for purpose-built student accommodation. It sets out locational criteria. It needs to meet an evidence need or release family housing. Just tell me, what would that evidence look like? Evidence of would secure the release of family housing from HMO use.
It could be in the context of growth envisaged by the universities. They have plans for growth, and in that context, delivery of PBSA would, if you like, prevent the occupation of existing family housing by. So if you could point to existing growth, or indeed an ongoing level of student occupation of HMOs in an area through lettings, services associated with the universities, it would be that would consider that to be sufficient information to just show that it would release or prevent the occupation of HMOs by students.
Okay, So that's in demonstrating evidence need. And then you set out locational criteria, don't you? Location of accommodation is easily accessible. And you speak about cycle and car parking, design, scale and layout. We'll leave criteria 5 for the moment. Adequate provision for recycling refuse, and then a management plan. So tell me about the management plan. A management plan or other controls put in place prior to occupation of any accommodation.
Yes, I think the presence of a management plan is really important for PBSA. For instance, you may get an application for PBSA within an area that is subject to an Article 4 direction already. You know, if it's already got quite an imbalance of communities, then the presence of a management plan alleviates those concerns about the over concentration of in this case student housing in one location. That's why it's really needed, we think, as part of this overall package. Otherwise you fall back into arguments about over concentration of areas, and even one scheme on its own, if you looked at a street, may contain so many units that if it was occupation in HMOs would have lead to concerns about an over predominance of students in one location. If you've got a management plan, which is our understanding of what the investors and operators of student housing have, then that obviously sets out proposals for dealing with issues and ensures that there is a mechanism for preventing them from coming forward.
Thank you for that. And let's move on to criteria 5. Now, this is the criteria. The proposal is not on a site allocated for other uses or where there are policies in place to protect the existing uses, such as open space, employment or facilities and services. Why is that necessary? What's the evidence for that? Why is it necessary? And I understand now your approach. So can you justify that to me, please?
In the original drafting, we were concerned about conflicts with other uses and frankly other aspirations within Winchester, because that's really the predominant location for this. However, at this stage, and it is obviously we're conscious it's late in the examination process, but we've read the statements submitted on behalf of Winchester College and on behalf of church commissioners and thought through actually the implications of that policy and how in their hearing states, for instance, they outlined 2 quite different concerns coming at it from 2 quite different ways. Yeah. And so it was thinking through whether there was any further changes or how we might respond to that has led us to think actually the plan does already have policies in place for ensuring, for instance, that important open space, employment, other uses are delivered. We already have frameworks for considering those other matters. The allocations themselves say what is and isn't, what is acceptable in that location. So this was felt actually to be unhelpful in terms of it was difficult to word in a way that actually articulated what we wanted, and we realised the plan as a whole actually dealt with matters of importance anyway.
Okay, I hear what you say, and then listening to the concerns of, for example, Winchester College, is this policy? I mean, the nub of that is that this policy actually is going to be a significant constraint to us. Is the aim of this policy to capture accommodation, for example, such as Winchester College or schools, or is it related to further education? Is that clear?
I think actually it's a fair point that this policy was drafted and envisaged really primarily looking at further and higher education. It's 18 plus accommodation, and Winchester colleges, no doubt others are sort of inadvertently caught by that. However, we do think that although some things sort of fall away with some of these matters, it's not a bad starting point for considering for being there. I think it's in terms of when we get those schemes coming forward. I think what I'm trying to say is that we don't see a conflict between this policy as drafted and the provision of boarding schools. We could put something in the supporting text to say that's not needed, but in some cases this is quite helpful in terms of it's looking at how we might go about delivering, appropriately located student accommodation. That's a different context for a boarding school under 18. We understand that, we accept that. There can't be off elsewhere in the city. It needs to be on in a much closer knit environment. We accept that, but we don't. The thought of actually working that through in the policy specifically wasn't clear to us how you might do that. And so at the moment, we think that we can resolve that by, in the first instance, removing that criterion 5, which deals with some of their issues, but leaving the policy in place as a whole.
Okay, should it have something then in the supporting text that makes that clear? For example, I don't know, transport assessments and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that would probably be an improvement, yes, that we could actually set out in the supporting text.
Okay.
That if you like, these set out the principles for purpose-built student accommodation. However, a bespoke or proportionate approach would be required for other types of student accommodation, for instance, those under 18, something along those lines. But obviously, we'd need to consider that further and come back to you.
Necessary for soundness. Sorry, I just want to understand your position.
Yes, I think it probably would be helpful and it would be necessary for soundness, because if you're Winchester College, you want that clarity to know the extent how we're going to approach policy. H9.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Rain. Could I open this up to the table, please? Mr. Beveridge?
Thank you. I represent City of Winchester Trust. We have two main concerns about the policy as drafted. One is the loose nature of subparagraph 2. Subparagraph 2. Yeah. In that it's just talking about the location of the accommodation being within easy walking distance. The City of Winchester is quite a small area, and you can walk most of the city, as one understands, is within and just outside the old walls, within 15-20 minutes very easily. So it effectively says you can go have a student accommodation anywhere within that sort of area. And we feel that there should be much stricter criteria, such as requiring it certainly first to be on the campuses or adjoining the campuses of educational establishments. And we know from other planning application a few years ago, when there was an application to build accommodation within a residential or adjacent to a residential area, it caused an enormous amount of unhappiness amongst the neighbourhood, and there was no policy at all to have any impact on that to prevent it being developed. And so I would like to see a much stronger clause being included that saying that it would generally be unacceptable to include student accommodation in established residential areas. That's the second point. And the third point I have is to do with the movement, cycle and car parking. That's paragraph 3. Student accommodation, in my view, should not, or in the Trust's view, should not have any private parking at all. Winchester University has strong anti-car policies in terms of student students bringing them onto the site or joining it. And therefore, I think the discouragement of private use, car use, which is the phrase used, I think is too relaxed, and it should be much firmer. Obviously, you need parking for services and for delivering and collecting students, but that's not really parking, that's just deliveries rather than more permanent stationary vehicles. So that's the other amendment I would like to see in that policy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Beveridge. Mr. Ricci?
Yes, Madam, just very briefly, we support the council's main modification. You won't be surprised to hear. We have set out, as you know, in our hearing statement, the reasons why we considered it would have probably unintended consequences in terms of the relationship, both with our allocation and with our planning application that's been made under the allocation. But I'm not going to trouble you with those unless you want to hear anything more about that, because we would agree with the council that the bottom line is it's not necessary to have 5 because they've got it controlled through other provisions, including in our case through the allocation.
Yeah, got that point. Okay, thank you very much. Is there anything else anyone wishes to say on that point? Okay, thank you. Can I now turn to policy H6? And this is the policy that deals with affordable housing. So we'll deal with H6, and then H7 is a related topic. That's the exception site. So the affordable housing policy, what it does is on the basis that viability has already been tested, what it has is a different requirement for it has an overall requirement for 40% of the gross number of dwellings as affordable, and then it has a reduced requirement for PDL. And the justification you've told me that, so the overall requirement is 40%, and then it reduces to 30% on PDL. And I understand the evidence base for that. That's the additional costs that are associated with PDL. And as we've heard many times, you've got a number of gritty brownfield sites, haven't you? So that's what that's aimed at. And then you have a reduced requirement again, and you say in the short term for dealing with the phosphorus and nitrates issue. So it's reduced to 35% on greenfield and 25% on PDL. And again, the reason for the reduction is the same, based on viability evidence. That's all to be secured by 106, which sets out that it's subject to review, and the requirement that if there's a significant decrease in the cost of nitrates, that's taken into account. Is that right? Am I right on all of that? I've understood all of that.
Yes.
Could you just explain to me then the impact of phosphates and why there's a reduction with that, please?
Yes. So if you develop anywhere in Winchester plan area, you run into nutrient neutrality and the requirements for that. The requirements for nitrogen have been with us for longer, and there are sort of established costs for that, and that's something that's relatively well understood.
So it's just in relation to phosphate.
Yeah, and then part of the plan area is only part of the plan area is subject to phosphates, and that's set out in the council's evidence on the biodiversity chapter. That has an additional cost, so the costs for mitigating phosphorus are higher than just mitigating nitrogen alone, and that, as that works through viability, is equivalent to in broadest terms, a 5% reduction in the cost of in affordable housing that can be borne on those sites, and that's really where we've come to from that. In terms of timing and why we are then if you like setting out how that will change over time. We are aware that there is the requirement for best available technology to come in and wastewater treatment works, which is the main pathway for phosphorus to enter into other sensitive sites. And our direction, if you like, is that will be in place from 2030, and that's the DEFRA nutrient calculators and all the rest. So I think the key issue for Winchester really is that the aim is to ensure that development that has to bear the costs of phosphorus in full, that is appropriately taken into account in affordable housing requirements. But then when those costs change, that there is mechanism in place to ensure that that the affordable housing can return back to what it would normally be expected to deliver on a site, either greenfield or brownfield.
So what you say is, if mitigation costs of nitrate and phosphate mitigation reduce significantly. What do you mean by that?
Yes, we have thought about this long and hard, frankly, about how we might articulate that a significant reduction in costs, whether you could quantify that, say a reduction by 80% or whatever. I think our position is, if you think about where we might be late in 2030, if we're in say the costs do reduce by a percentage, a quantified figure, we would still be in a position where, for instance, there might be other costs, other viability policy or delivery costs. The whole viability picture might be in a different position anyway. So it was the value that you would add by being specific about a percentage drop in this one policy cost that we weren't sure was actually helpful. What we did think was helpful was being clear about the earliest date in which this could come in, which we did know, and that's the subject to the main modification that you have on this, which is about the introduction of best available technology in 2030. Although the plan obviously is subject to an early review, we still think it's helpful to include these signals now so that factors into consideration of sites, land values and expectations, all of that, so that all parties are aware of where we're looking to head to by 2030, and with that position reaffirmed in the next iteration of this plan. So we thought long and hard about whether we could quantify it. We're not sure about the value that could bring, but we did think we could at least provide certainty on the date.
Okay, thank you for that. And then the policy goes on to say 35% low cost homes and 65%. This is for market-led schemes, 65% of social rent or affordable rent. Yes, so if you look at my question, so in terms of low cost homes, is it justified by robust evidence? The 35% low cost homes, and would that be meeting government expectation?
Yes. So as a starting point in terms of the needs evidence, the needs evidence was in the Shamar update was recommending a 75-25 split in favour of rented provision. As Mr. Ayling will come on to, the council has taken into account both the policy requirements in the NPPF around affordable home ownership, but also viability and a focus on overall delivery and translating that into a policy requirement.
Sorry, would you mind speaking up, Mr. Ayling? Sorry, I've got this behind me.
So yes, the need split, as it were, would be a 75-25% split in favour of rented affordable housing.
Yeah, yeah.
But in translating that into a policy requirement, the council then needs to consider the NPPF position in terms of affordable home ownership, 10% affordable home ownership, and also its viability evidence. And there are policy factors therefore to take to overlay on the needs position as a starting point.
Okay, could I ask you that the cry that you always get from the room is there needs to be more flexibility on this. How have you taken that into account, and what do you say to that? Mr. Rayling, I don't mind who, somebody from the council, and then I'll open it up to the table.
Forgive me, I'm just putting out the reference, but the NPPF says that where affordable housing is required, then plans should state what tenure, what type of affordable housing is needed. We're expected to come up with a position that's set out in the plan here. There is I think scope as always to consider those needs, but we're expected to come out with a position, and that's what we've done.
Yeah.
So, Mum, it's paragraph 63.
Yeah.
In the framework, policy should essentially. I think it's one is essentially providing clarity. A single position providing clarity when somebody is developing a scheme and modelling the viability of it, and that's what the policy is seeking to achieve.
Actually, it's 64 in the NPPF we're working on.
It's 64. Where the need for affordable housing, our debt planning policy should specify the type of affordable housing required and expect it to be met on site unless, and of course you do say that it should be provided on site, affordable housing should be provided on site, and then you set out criteria there. Okay, so would policy H6's required tenure split for market-led housing schemes be effective in meeting community requirements? Would further flexibility be required to ensure the breakdown relates to the most recent evidence of need? Could I don't mind who.
I think the split you see in front of you has a basis in the evidence of needs, and as Mr. Allen said, with the input of viability as well. I think we're conscious that the SHMA also identified a need for social rent as well. Our position you see in front of you is informed by the viability evidence that came through, really, and the position that what development could and could not bear. Council took a choice that we would be looking to maintain the headline 40% figure. We go for numbers rather than a different tenure split with social rent, but we're conscious that the council's own actions and other RPs, there are other scope for securing grants for our own schemes and schemes for other parties that can include an element of social rent in it. So in as far as this policy goes, we think we're going as far as we can in terms of viability, conscious of the fact that we've got our own housing programme and the actions of other RPs are there to be able to provide an additional route for filling in those gaps, if you like.
Okay, could I open this up to the table, please? Mr. Young?
Yeah, thank you very much. So this is all a bit like rearranging chairs on the Titanic, isn't it? Here we are discussing not very impressive levels of affordable housing and how much will be affordable rent. But the fact is the council's own evidence, as we've set out, identifies 10,158 dwellings. That's their figure each year, 537 new affordable dwellings. And this plan won't deliver that, because you'll have noticed that's 65% of all the housing in the district, and we're talking about 35% for viability reasons. I'm not questioning the viability. And so if you then take into account that 70% of the housing in the plan is existing commitments, then you're looking at something higher than 70% on the remaining sites to try and deal with the 10,158. Now, there's nothing in national policy yet that says that you need to meet your affordable housing needs. But of course, it's completely contrary to being effective when you seek to produce plans, which nearly all of them are, which only really reflect the interests of existing homeowners. Local plans are said to be a product of democracy, but they're nothing of the kind. That's absolute nonsense. You don't hear at these sessions from the people who would benefit from the affordable housing, as some of the more brave inspectors have been prepared to say in appeal decisions, the people who desperately can't get hold of affordable housing, the statistics that Shelter churn out each week, the reports, the extent of it. And this plan simply seeks, having identified a figure of over 10,000, to absolutely not deliver it, even though that's their own figure. Now, how is that an effective plan? Leaving aside, of course, the 40,000 unmet housing needs to the south, of which, of course, a significant component will be affordable. I've talked before about doing a recent inquiry in Southampton for 100% affordable housing, which, of course, local councillors blocked. Why wouldn't they? Nobody wants affordable housing. And so, as a consequence of which, a lot of what's coming forward in Southampton and the other major urban areas isn't delivering affordable at all. So now you've got this enormous amount of affordable housing not being delivered here, where it obviously could be delivered. It's not being delivered in the urban areas to the south. And why is that a good plan? Why is that an effective plan? Malcolm Rivet was the inspector, together with Jonathan Lee, in the West of England plan. And when they sent their post-mortem letter, they pointed out, on the basis of evidence about affordable housing and how you can actually try and deliver the figure the council identified, that the figure for the West of England of 100,000 was the wrong figure. And actually, they accepted the consortium's development, that's 10 of my clients, of 140,000 a year, which was a much more realistic basis, because many urban sites, like the site over here and other sites, won't deliver as much affordable housing. The plan allows them to deliver less, and of course they can viability test even less below that. So what you'll end up with is a huge deficit against the council's own recorded figure. And remember, that's the council's own identified figure from their own consultants, generating their own figures based on their own assumptions that people should be spending significant amounts of money on their rent out of already diminishing wages, on top of the fact that they include a huge amount of private sector as a justification for reducing affordable housing. And what this really is producing yet another plan for the people who already have homes and branding it as democracy. This is a Liberal Democrat council. The Liberal Democrats are the most opposed to housing in the country. They proposed at the last elections 150,000 as the annual figure, half the figure that the new government has introduced. Luckily, the young Liberal Democrats came into the chamber of their conference and said, and you'll forgive me for this, but it was on their T-shirts, build the bloody houses. Because people are sick of this. They're sick of this constant attempt to suppress housing. And the Liberal Democrats, I'm afraid, are the worst at it. Now, because of that, they accepted a figure which was originally in their manifesto of 380,000. So you've now got the party that represents this authority with a figure not of 300,000 that people think the government won't reach, but 380,000. And it's no good local parties disassociating themselves with the reality of their political manifestos. 380,000 a year is a £1.8 million figure. That's a Liberal Democrat policy going into the last election. And all this plan does is spectacularly fail. Now, I said before, you've got one greenfield allocation that on this policy will deliver 35% for 150 homes. That's what this plan does. And that's why I said this plan is it is one of the worst plans in this country right now. And plenty of them are failing, like Bournemouth, like Solihull, like Shropshire, like Elmbridge. They're failing because inspectors can see they're ineffective, even if you think they've passed the duty to cooperate, which they haven't, with the greatest respect. But more than that, there is absolutely nothing in this plan to try and deliver affordable housing in the Winchester area. And there's my client sat on a site which he's bought, John Bloor has bought the golf course, who could put an application in tomorrow, but if you find this plan sound, you'll block it, and you'll block all the 35% affordable housing on 1,000 homes. 350 new affordable homes for the people who serve us in the cafes and the restaurants in this town. But instead, we're going to have one site for 150 that delivers not even 50 affordable homes. And I accept that the Carla site will keep delivering affordable homes as long as they can get through all their licensing and all the difficulties they've got on that site. But the fact is that that site was originally identified as a reserve site over 20 years ago. It's late. Those affordable homes on that site should have come forward a decade ago. So what's this plan actually doing? And what's this plan doing to deliver housing? The people who want this plan through are the local councillors who do not want affordable housing, and they don't want new housing in Winchester, and yet it is the main economic hub. And my learned friend, Mr. Marici, was here for his site, which is an enormous employment site. So even more employment, even more people ploughing in from Southampton, from Eastleigh, coming into that employment site on the south side of town, and we still haven't got the houses for them. So the affordable housing is where it all falls down, because this plan doesn't even attempt to meet their own affordable housing needs that they have identified, let alone do anything about the absolutely enormous unmet affordable housing need to the south, which is why it fails the duty to cooperate, why it fails the effectiveness. And on your latest missive, thank you for investigating the issue of a 2024 start date, which certainly the Inspector of the Isle of Wight has adopted and all plans should adopt, instead of going back to 2020, is that their contribution towards the unmet need to the south is now down to 100. Now that is an ineffective plan. This plan doesn't go ahead. We'll deliver 35% affordable housing from a house builder who'll submit a planning application this year. I'm already reading all the papers, but we won't do it if this plan is found sound.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Young. Okay, response from the council, you've heard it there. Great concern with regard to what this is going to deliver.
I think the main thing to say really is that we've already outlined, we feel we've maximised the amount of affordable housing that can be delivered through the development strategy that's been brought forward. I think much of the other discussions we've touched upon in broad terms in earlier sessions, and I accept the views that are held around this table. But when we've looked to deliver our affordable housing numbers, we have sought to maximise it through our tenure choice, through focusing on affordable rent rather than social rent as a choice there to ensure our numbers are maximised. And we also have small scale but helpful contributions in things like rural exceptions policy and other flexibilities. We also have the participant statement outlines council housing strategy, where we're undertaking our own measures to deliver around 1,000 properties by 2032. They are not additional properties to our overall numbers, but they are of the tenures that are needed in regards to our affordable housing requirement. And that's really, in terms of broad terms, what we have in terms of what we're aiming to do on the affordable housing.
Okay, I've heard both sides and all the other views. I'll take a view on it. Is there anything else on that point? Okay, let's move on to H7. This is again dealing with affordable housing, but this is dealing with exception sites to meet local need. So it supports development on exception sites in exceptional circumstances. Could I ask the policy? Could I ask the council to introduce this policy?
Yes, so this is pretty much continuation of adopted plan policy. So this has been part of the development plan for some time in Winchester. The participant statement does outline what has been delivered in recent years through this. We are still receiving pre-application consultations on this under this banner. They don't come along every year, but when they do, they are welcome and do generally go through with, are permitted and do deliver. We think they're an important part of our overall package, providing a bit of local flexibility, and it is additionality in terms of our overall figures. I wanted to outline there is a main modification.
Oh yes,
on
I'll come on to those.
on
I'll come on
this.
to. Can I say para 82 with regard to rural housing? How does it relate to that, or is that the genesis of it? That's in rural areas, planning policies should be responsive to local circumstances, support housing developments that reflect local needs.
Exactly, it's born from that.
So that's the genesis of the policy. And in terms of flexibility, what flexibility is in that policy?
Well, it does allow in certain circumstances for an element of market housing to be part of the mix, if that can be demonstrated. Obviously, there's a balancing act here, but sometimes that can be helpful without removing the emphasis on affordable housing, and that's probably the most important aspect of the flexibility attached to this.
So it's where it says the flexibility, if you need to bring forward an element of market housing subject to viability, that needs to be viability tested.
Exactly. We think it's important that is demonstrated. It is not the new normal for the schemes of this type.
Yeah, okay, I've got that. And you're suggesting some MMs. Now you're suggesting, I was going to deal with these together, M6 and M7. There are a number of MMs. So the first one is the one that we, sorry, dealing with MM39 is the one about giving clarity on the introduction of best available technology at wastewater treatment works in 2030, isn't it? Can you introduce the next one in relation to H6?
Yeah, so on H6, there's a MM39 refers to when we talk about the affordable housing component of market-led housing schemes, there is a modification to talk about the fact that social rented is the priority, but unless more recent evidence has been agreed by the local planning authority that for that locality demonstrates otherwise. What that's trying to do is outline the council's position that social rent is priority, but we absolutely accept the fact that affordable rent has been the basis of our modelling, but it's trying to send a message that we would look to deliver social rent where we can, where the circumstances allow, through provision of grant or other measure.
So that's within the policy text, isn't it?
Yes.
A policy change. So for market-led schemes, the affordable housing should be provided in accordance with the following proportions that are set out. So the 35% low-cost home ownership and 65% social rented, with social rented as a priority, unless more recent evidence that has been agreed with the council for that locality demonstrates otherwise. What do you mean for that locality?
Typically, we, in terms of nomination rights and that sort of thing, our approach, as I understand it, has been the parish or neighbouring parishes. So that is that is what the locality or what the area has meant. So that's probably, that would be the best fit for that.
Thank you. And then you've got a suggested for policy H7, and it's the one that we touched on, isn't it?
Yeah, Mark, can I just add that we are reflecting on this further, and we're wondering whether or area is specific enough. So we may in due course amend this to provide direct reference to parish or adjoining parishes rather than or area. But as and when we come to that final view, we'll obviously let you know.
So what is your favoured approach? What's the approach that you're putting forward? Yeah.
In terms of what we're seeking to achieve, we're conscious with rural exception sites that sometimes the level of development you're trying to bring forward may be slightly higher than the need you can demonstrate in that particular settlement. And so we're looking to enable an approach where the justification can be considered over a reasonable area for people who want to live in a part of the south of the district, say, or that. So the proposed modification is to say settlement or area. What we think we actually mean, as Mr. Fraser-Urquhart's saying, really, is that the best fit is probably with our nomination rights, which in terms of a cascade, the way we work it is in the parish or adjoining parishes. And I think that would probably be a better fit, given the fact that some of our smaller settlements are on the periphery of one parish and better relate to next door, for instance.
Okay, yeah, hear what you say, Okay, is there anything else that anyone wishes to contribute today? Well, thank you very much, everyone, for your contributions. It's now, oh, look at that. Bang on time. So we'll be back again at 2 o'clock and we'll be talking design, all things design. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your contributions, all participants.